Okay. Hello, everyone. First of all, a warm welcome to Aya Majzoub of HRW, who has been kind and to join us, though she has a very busy schedule. Before we start, let me say a couple of things about TLDN, the Lebanese Diaspora Network. It aspires to a sovereign, democratic, pluralistic, fair, just, and prosperous Lebanon, where citizens are equal before an independent judicial system under the rule of law with accountability and transparency. The mission of TLDN is to enable Lebanese abroad to communicate, coordinate, collaborate, and cooperate. Our mission is to engage, activate, and influence Lebanon and its diasporic community to work efficiently and effectively on specific missions. The sole objective of the missions is re-establishing a sovereign and democratic state where citizens' rights are valued and protected. We are determined to fight corruption, political clientelism, violation of rights, and to enforce the rule of law. We pride ourselves on our values, which are honesty, integrity, transparency, non-sectarianism, and democracy. They're all shared values by all members of TLDN. And I want to welcome Faris Wahbi to our midst on this one. He has been kind enough to join us from our New Lebanon. And I think between our New Lebanon and TLDN share the same values and the same mission and vision. After that, I just want the audience to note that questions are best asked on the chat, even though we may allow, time for people to ask questions by raising their hand. So please understand, if we don't get to you, it's better if you put your question on the chat. Aya has already received some questions, and she will go through them, but I'm going to ask her, we will give priority to the attendants if they want to ask questions, and she will just go through the questions she has as she sees fit. With that, I'm going to turn this over to Eli Abon, who's going to introduce Aya.
Thank you very much, René. Hello, everyone. So my name is Eli Abon. I'm a member of the Lebanese Diaspora Network, currently in Canada. So before introducing Aya, I just wanted to say that the session we're planning today will go as follows. So Aya will go through her own presentation for about 10 minutes, and then this will be followed by questions and answers as per the guidance provided by René. So today we're very lucky to have Aya Majzoub with us. Aya is the Lebanon and Bahrain researcher at Human Rights Watch. She's focused on the Middle East and she's part of the Middle East and North Africa division. To that, Aya was the deputy head of digital investigations at the Commission for International Justice and Accountability, and she did previously work with the Lebanese Ministry of Interior on refugees issues. She also conducted research for several think tanks, holds a master's in Middle Eastern Studies from Harvard University, and a BA in Politics, Psychology, and Sociology from the University of Cambridge. Aya, thank you very much for your time. We're very happy to have you, and handing over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone, for having me today. It's an honor to be here. So I was asked to speak about the research and the advocacy that we're doing around the Beirut blast. So I'll start first by sort of explaining the research that we've done, and then show how we've used this research for advocacy. So over the last couple of years, we've been watching the domestic investigation with a lot of apprehension, knowing full well some of the weaknesses of Lebanon's judiciary, including the politicization of the judiciary, how susceptible it is to political interference, the lack of technical capacities, as well as a lot of due process failures codified even within Lebanon's criminal procedures and criminal laws. And so we set out to investigate, to the best of our ability, what caused the Beirut blast. And that investigation was divided into three parts. The first part is, how did the ammonium nitrate get to Lebanon in the first place? The second part is, who knew about the ammonium nitrate when it came to Lebanon, and why did it sit in the port for between 6 to 7 years? And then the last part, what triggered the explosion on August the 4th. So on the first part, I mean, of course, we aren't an investigative mission. We don't have expertise in international shipping routes or international, the world of international trade. But what we were able to do was really cast doubt on the official narrative that had been adopted by the Lebanese state, which is that the Rosus, the ship carrying the ammonium nitrate, came to Lebanon as a coincidence in order to pick up some seismic equipment that the Ministry of Energy had been using and take that seismic equipment to Jordan. And so, essentially the theory that was being put forward by the government is that it was a complete coincidence that the Rosus with the ammonium nitrate ended up in Beirut. Through our research and our conversations with experts and our examination of the official documents related to the ship, we actually found that theory not to be plausible, because the ship that was the Rosus, which was carrying the ammonium nitrate, came to Lebanon. It was already full. There was no way that it could have loaded the seismic equipment that it was supposed to transport to Jordan. In addition, it wasn't the type of ship that could have transported some of this equipment. The equipment weighed about 400 tons. So it was physically impossible for a ship like the Rosus to have taken the seismic equipment to Jordan. When we started digging further, then we also found a lot of hidden links between the owners of the ammonium nitrate, the owners of the ship, with Syrian businessmen and with Hezbollah. So, for example, an investigation that was conducted by Firas Hatoumat Al-Jadid showed that the company that owned the ammonium nitrate, Savaro, was a front company or was a shell company that had links to 2 Syrian businessmen who had previously been sanctioned, one of them for procuring ammonium nitrate for the Syrian regime at the end of 2013. We also found that the owner of the ship had links to a bank that had links to Hezbollah. So of course we couldn't prove, why the ammonium nitrate was in Lebanon, but we were able to disprove the theory that the ammonium nitrate ended up in Lebanon by accident. But the biggest part of our investigation was really looking into who knew about the ammonium nitrate when it came to Lebanon, and who had a responsibility to act and who failed to act. So for this part of the investigation, we reviewed over hundreds of official documents from the port, customs, security agencies, from the government. On all of it showed that several entities not only had knowledge of the ammonium nitrate in the port, but knew of the dangers that the ammonium nitrate posed, and tacitly accepted the risk of the ammonium nitrate. They had within their mandate a responsibility to act. They could have acted to remove the danger, and they failed to do so. So in our legal determination, this amounted to a violation of the right to life. So the entities that are most implicated are: 1, the Ministry of Public Works and Transport, which oversees the ports; 2, the Ministry of Finance, which oversees customs; 3, the Lebanese army, which under Lebanese law is responsible for any military grade ammonium nitrate that enters the country; 4, state security, which were the ones who began investigating the ammonium nitrate; and 5, the Lebanese president, as well as the former Prime Minister Hassan Diab. I'm not going to go into details about all of their responsibilities now, but happy to answer anything in the Q&A. But overwhelmingly, the evidence showed that these individuals were warned about the danger. They often miscommunicated the danger to the judiciary. They had a responsibility to act. They could have done so and removed the ammonium nitrate, but they failed to do so. And then the last part of the investigation was really looking into the various theories around what caused the explosion on August the 4th. And this is the part where I think we had the least expertise. And so we sort of highlighted the various theories that exist, but didn't take a position on what we think would have been most likely to have caused the fire and the subsequent explosion. So our work and our investigation, really, we produced a report that we released last year on the anniversary of the blast that was over 700 pages. And we wanted to put this information out into the public domain. And to this day, it remains the most detailed accounting of what happened leading up to August 4th and who was responsible. We also made a point of making sure that all of the documents that we were able to obtain, we published, and we translated everything into English to make it easier for prosecutors, investigative journalists, and researchers in other parts of the world or in Lebanon to use this research and these documents as a base for further investigation. So this is on the the big investigation to the responsibilities for the Beirut blast. I'll now move on to how we use this information and the advocacy that we've been doing over the last few years on the Beirut blast. So very soon, the day after the Beirut blast happened, we already had concerns about the ability of the Lebanese judiciary to impartially and independently investigate this catastrophe and this crime, particularly given within the first few hours of the explosion, it had already become apparent that high-level individuals in the government and in the security services were aware of the existence of the ammonium nitrate in the port. So initially, we had called for an independent domestic investigation with the participation of international experts. However, a few days later, when the government referred the case to the Judicial Council, which is an exceptional court that doesn't meet international standards, we couldn't support a process through the Judicial Council. And so that's when we started calling for a fully international investigation. So there are many problems with the Judicial Council. But the two most serious problems are, one, that there's no right to appeal. So the decisions taken by the judicial investigator and then by the Judicial Council itself are not open to any form of appeal from either the victims, the public, or even the defendants, which is a grave violation of fair trial standards. And the other issue is that there's no limit on pretrial detention. So as we're seeing now, some people have been detained for almost 2 years now without any charge. The investigation is suspended indefinitely at the moment. And so their right to a speedy trial is being violated. So we started calling for an international investigation the summer of 2020. And the responses that we were hearing were, one, let's give the domestic investigation a chance. 2, it's not the right time. 3, this is not the right kind of incident for an international investigation. And D, this isn't a human rights issue. This is an issue of administrative negligence. We were able to disprove or present evidence against the last point, that it wasn't that. So that was part of the reason that we published this big investigation into the blast, is to prove that it was a human rights issue. It was a violation of the right to life. So after the publication of our report, we stopped receiving these retorts about whether or not the blast was a human rights issue. So we were left with, this isn't the right time, and let's give the domestic investigation a chance. Unfortunately, the domestic investigation has now been paused since December 2021. And even before then, it had been riddled with political interference and various due process violations. So it became very clear, over the last year that the domestic investigation was unlikely to result in an impartial and credible truth and justice for the families of the victims and for the Lebanese public. Fortunately, most diplomats we've spoken to recently share our assessment that the domestic investigation is probably not going anywhere, at least not anytime soon. So now the obstacle that we're facing in getting an international investigation is the position of France. So several countries who have lost nationals in the blast have expressed interest in pursuing an international investigation, but France has not yet done so. And given what other countries have told us is the special relationship between France and Lebanon, no country wants to move forward on an international investigation for the Beirut blast without the green light from France. And this green light France still hasn't given. So over the last several weeks, we really focused a lot of our advocacy on France, trying to hold Macron accountable to the promise that he made to the Lebanese people when he first came to Beirut after the blast and promised an international investigation. So the route for an international investigation that we've identified to be the most optimistic is through the Human Rights Council, which is a UN body based in Geneva that monitors the human rights records of all the countries around the world. And one of the mandates of this Human Rights Council is forming these investigative bodies, whether they're fact-finding missions or commissions of inquiry into situations where rights are abused, either a trend of abusing human rights or an incident that results in a grave violation of human rights. So since 2006, the Human Rights Council has authorized almost 40 such investigative missions, including one on Lebanon in the aftermath of the July war in 2006, where it sent a team to investigate war crimes committed by Israel in Lebanon. And so the way that these bodies are set up is a state or a group of states put forward a resolution at the Human Rights Council that would establish this international investigation. This resolution is then voted on by the 47 members of the Human Rights Council, and it's adopted by a simple majority. So now there's a Human Rights Council session upcoming in September. I think it starts in mid-September. So we're trying to find a state or a group of states who are willing to put forward this resolution. As I mentioned, France has been standing in the way of such an initiative, but we're hoping that the pressure that we generated in the media and on August 4th over the last several weeks has hopefully softened their position a bit. So we are cautiously optimistic about the prospects of some action by the Human Rights Council on Lebanon in September. So I'll stop here for now, and I'd like to leave a lot of space for questions and answers.
Thank you very much, Aya. So as promised, we'll move on to Q&A now. So there are a few questions that were sent before that I'd like to start with, Aya, if you don't mind. So the first one is about specifically the role of France in this. Why, in your opinion, or in the opinion of Human Rights Watch, is the plea for an international investigation has been ignored so far? And more specifically, is it not too late for France to act now? Do they still have the political capital and the credit to take action on this specific issue?
On the first question of the role that France has played, I mean, I prefer not to hypothesize about the motivations of France in not advocating for an international investigation, despite the fact that Macron had previously stated that he would do so. But what's obvious is that France, through Macron's roadmap that he proposed in 2020, has given the Lebanese leaders renewed legitimacy. He's invested a lot of his political capital in trying to keep this establishment afloat through asking them to do a series of reforms within a certain period of time, with the promise of unlocking billions of dollars in aid at the end of it. The Lebanese politicians obviously missed every single deadline that had been set, but unfortunately Macron keeps reiterating that the roadmap is still on the table. So what seems to be the case is that the international community, despite a lot of their harsh rhetoric on Lebanese politicians, are still behaving in a business as usual way. They're still meeting with these politicians. They're still issuing statements of support for these politicians. In one of the first official visits that Miati, or the first official foreign visit that Miati did when his government was finally created, was to the Elysee. And so it seems like the international community, and France included, are prioritizing what they call stability. So this, the continuation of the status quo at the expense of accountability and justice, which might lead to a shift in some of the power dynamics in the country. And the point that we keep reiterating in all of our meetings is that while propping up the same establishment may result in short-term instability, over the long term, it's just creating an untenable situation in the country that just isn't sustainable. I mean, neither the economic situation or the social situation in the country is sustainable. And so keeping these people in power is actually sowing the seeds of instability further down the line. So we hope that these messages are the more I think that the international community gets frustrated by the lack of reforms, the more I think that kind of messaging works.
Thank you very much. So I take two questions from the chat box. So Sergio is asking about the quantities. So I read Sergio's question as is. So I have read that certain investigators mentioned that the explosion was equivalent to 550 tons of ammonium nitrate. Obviously, the rest wasn't there. Is this reliable and official information? Like, do you have anything on the quantities in the, in your investigation?
So obviously that's not something which we can determine, but we know for sure that the FBI report that was issued. So right after the explosion, the FBI did a small investigation into what caused the blast. And they presented a report almost a year later to the Lebanese judiciary, which was leaked to the media and to some other organizations. And that report, that FBI report, found that about 500 tons of ammonium nitrate exploded. What happened to the rest? I mean, some of it might have just not exploded and fell into the sea. But the theories are that someone was benefiting from the ammonium nitrate. Who that was, of course, we don't know. But in the photos that we were able to get from inside the hangar where the ammonium nitrate was stored, we did find that there was a big hole in the in one of the walls, which may have suggested that this material was being siphoned off. Again, there are many theories about who was responsible and where this material was being taken to, but that wasn't something that we were able to conclusively determine.
Thank you very much. And another question from Caroline is about who represents Lebanon on the Human Rights Council, and more specifically in the September session. Is Lebanon going to be represented? And if yes, who?
So every country has a mission in Geneva with a representative, usually at the rank of ambassador, usually. But Lebanon will not be on the Human Rights Council in September. So the Human Rights Council is made up of 47 countries divided into regional blocks. And the members of the Human Rights Council rotate every 3 years. So for the September session, Lebanon will not be on the Human Rights Council, but of course they are represented through the delegation in Geneva. But I think, it's important to note that these kinds of investigative bodies that are set up by the Human Rights Council do not necessarily need the consent of the state being investigated. And actually, in most cases, they go ahead without the consent of the state being investigated for obvious reasons. Because the reason that these investigative bodies are set up is because there is a feeling amongst the international community that the state itself is either unwilling or unable to impartially and independently investigate the human rights abuses.
Thank you very much, Aya. So another question that is a bit sensitive is about the Lebanese army. So is your conclusion or Human Rights Watch conclusion, that the army is somehow responsible for this? If yes, to what extent, on how specifically? And then the second part of the question is, do you think there are avenues to use the military assistance that the Lebanese army is receiving coverage to encourage the army to play a more positive role in the investigation, or at least not to obstruct the investigation if they are obstructing it?
Yeah. So on the role of the army, I mean, our evidence showed unequivocally that the army was in part responsible for the ammonium nitrates. So under Lebanese law, we have a law called the Weapons and Ammunitions Law, which says that ammonium nitrate with a nitrogen grade of over 33% is considered material used to make explosives, and is therefore under the jurisdiction of the army. So the army is supposed to inspect the material when it comes in, and it's supposed to monitor the material while it is in the country. So the material should have been under the jurisdiction of the army. In November of 2015, the army sent a letter to customs asking them to do a test regarding the nitrogen grade of the ammonium nitrate. They received the test back, which showed that the nitrogen grade of the ammonium nitrate was 34.5%, which again, under Lebanese law, would have classified it as material used to make explosives, and therefore should have been immediately placed under the jurisdiction of the Lebanese army. And there should have been an investigation into why the Lebanese army hadn't inspected the ship when it first came into the country. But what the army did, and this was a letter signed on behalf of the former commander of the army, Jean Ahwaji, they sent a letter back to customs saying, thank you for those results. We don't have any need for this ammonium nitrate. Please resell it or re-export it. So that was a clear derogation of their responsibility. And to make matters worse, right after the explosion that happened on August 4th, for the next several weeks, the army kept releasing press statements saying that they had found, X number of tons of ammonium nitrate or other dangerous chemicals in various areas around the country and had taken them over or safely destroyed them, which shows that they do have a mandate to do so. They're capable of doing so. But in the case of the ammonium nitrate in the port, they failed to do so. And regarding the role in the investigation, I mean, we haven't seen any evidence to suggest that the army is blocking any of the investigations. So Jean Ahwaji did go to the his questioning. Several members of high-ranking members in the military intelligence also went to their questioning, and they were charged by the judicial investigator for their role. And so we haven't seen any evidence that they've been obstructing the investigation.
Yeah, thank you very much. So my next question is about the people who are already arrested. Do you have any notion or idea about whether all of the people arrested are now should be cleared somehow, or if some of them should remain under arrest? In this case, why everyone is detained, why they don't process basically these cases properly and determine who should remain under arrest and who should be released?
Yeah. So I'll preface this by saying that, obviously we're not a judicial body, and so it's not up to us to decide who should be charged and arrested and who shouldn't be. But the evidence that we found shows that some of the high-ranking members of the port and customs, as well as some high-ranking security officials, did receive multiple warnings about the ammonium nitrate and the dangers of the ammonium nitrate failed to act. But of course, I mean, regardless of whether or not they're culpable for the explosion, everybody has, including them, has a right to a fair trial and have their due process rights respected. And this isn't happening in the current investigation due to several factors. One is like I said, the laws relating to the Judicial Council give the judicial investigator the right to hold suspects in cases referred to the Judicial Council in pretrial detention indefinitely. So the law doesn't set any limits on pretrial detention in the way that it sets them for any other crimes and in the way that international law dictates. That's one issue. Second is that the way that Lebanese law works, and particularly the law related to the Judicial Council, is that the entire investigation has to be finished before the judge can release his indictment. And in that indictment, he then either charges the certain individuals or releases them. But given Lebanese law, the judge can't release parts of the investigation before others. So we have to wait for the conclusion of the investigation. And as you're all aware, there have been multiple arbitrary legal challenges against the judge and the judges looking into the judge, and a lot of political decisions that have resulted in the investigation being indefinitely suspended. However, the one thing I'll say is that the judge himself, Judge Bitar, does have the power to release individuals if the evidence against them doesn't hold. And he has done so for several individuals. So he's released almost 10 people, I think, from detention between April and June of last year. But he's currently unable to look to further the investigation given its suspension. So he can't issue any decisions regarding new arrests or releasing people who are already detained.
Okay, thank you very much. So another question, I think that is more in line with the Human Rights Watch mandate, basically, is whether there is a need for any action by the Lebanese government or other governments for international bodies to take action in this case. Like, is there a possibility for the international bodies to take action without being requested to do so by neither the Lebanese government nor any other government? Sorry.
Yeah, unfortunately, without any other government, no. Without Lebanon, actually, no, that's not. Okay, so I'll explain the three avenues for an international investigation. So one is the Secretary General himself, the Secretary General of the UN himself can set up a board of inquiry or a fact-finding mission into issues that he sees are grave human rights violations that affect peace and security worldwide. And previous Secretary Generals have used this power that they're given to set up such missions. Unfortunately, the current Secretary General has been adamant that he wouldn't use this power that he has. He hasn't used it on any issues that we had advocated with him to use this power. So that option was immediately taken off the table. The second option is for a special rapporteur to initiate an investigation. So a special rapporteur is a UN human rights expert on a particular issue. So you have, special rapporteur on extrajudicial executions, on freedom of speech, on torture, etc. And there is a special rapporteur on, his title is very long, but it's something along the lines of the special rapporteur on the storage and disposal of toxic and dangerous substances and chemicals, something like that. So there is a special rapporteur whose mandate would directly apply to the Beirut blast. And we did do some advocacy with him to try to get him to take up this issue and initiate an investigation. But unfortunately, he did not do so. And so that left us with the only third option that we have, which is through the Human Rights Council. And because the Human Rights Council is an intergovernmental body made up of states, we do need states to put forward a resolution that would establish this international investigation. But again, Lebanon's approval or consent, while valuable because they would grant access to the investigators, is not essential.
Thank you. So there is a question again in the chat box from Caroline about the reason, also the reason of the explosion itself. So now we know, you described a little bit about the nitrate, everything around the stock itself. But were you able to know at least what are the possibilities for what actually detonated on that day?
No, I mean, we did include in the report the theory that the explosion was caused by an Israeli attack, but again, we weren't able to find conclusive evidence to show that that was the case. And actually, on the contrary, a lot of people had said that they'd heard the sound of planes prior to the explosion, but that a lot of experts have explained away that the sound of planes by showing that it was the chemical reaction between the ammonium nitrate and other material prior to the explosion that could have resulted in the same sound. So obviously we can't disprove this theory, but neither can we prove it.
Okay, thank you. And then another question about Le Monde article. So did you get any reaction on the article, more specifically from the French authorities? Are you planning or do you have access to meet high-level French officials to discuss the matter?
Yeah, so over the last couple of years, we have been in contact with high-level French officials. We've met with the team here in Beirut, we've met with members of the Élysée, Macron's advisors, and we've met with the people responsible for Lebanon and the Middle East at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So we have been actively engaging all three of those kind of groups of people in order to push for an international investigation. On whether it's gotten, the Le Monde article that we wrote, which basically publicly said that France is standing in the way of an international investigation. It's gotten a lot of pickup from French media and some positive responses from within France, but I prefer not to elaborate more given that some of those responses were confidential.
Thank you very much. And my other question is actually about the sanctions. So are there precedents in international law where sanctions were imposed on people involved in similar incidents? And if yes, is this contingent on international investigation, or the UN or other governments can act already before an investigation is concluded?
So a lot of countries, including the US, Canada, Australia, the UK, and now the EU, have sanctions regimes where they target individuals who are engaged in either massive corruption or grave human rights abuses. So those frameworks exist, and Lebanese leaders can be sanctioned under those sanctions regimes for their role in the August 4 blast. And this is something that we're actively working on. So in the next few weeks, we'll be submitting a sanctions dossier to the US Treasury with details about the culpability of 7 individuals that we've determined are most responsible for the Beirut blast, and ask that they be sanctioned under the US's global Magnitsky sanctions regime, which is their human rights sanctions regime. We're also doing the same for the, we'll also follow up with a submission to the EU as well, which also have a sanctions regime against human rights violators. So yes, the frameworks do exist. No state has yet sanctioned Lebanese officials for their role in the Beirut blast, but this is something that we're actively working towards. And it's not contingent on an international investigation. I mean, each country has its own standards for determining what the threshold for evidence is and the kinds of evidence that they accept or don't in those kinds of cases. And they do their own investigations. They solicit information sometimes from NGOs like ours and many others, but they do their own investigations into who they want to place on the sanctions regime based on the evidence that they feel is most credible. So this is something that we've been pushing for and will continue to push for as one of the only avenues for accountability that exists on the international arena.
Thank you very much. So another question is about the role of Hezbollah. You know, there are 2 versions of the story. One of them blaming Hezbollah for not only knowing about the nitrate, but actually using them, and shipping some of the nitrate to Syria for use by the Syrian regime. and others who are more or less pro-Hezbollah are actually accusing the Syrian opposition groups of being behind this and taking some quantities to be used also in the war in Syria. In all the work that you've done on this issue, were you able to identify, any theory that is close to one of these two theories, or is it so vague until now?
No, I don't think the evidence that we have would conclusively be able to prove any theory. However, as I mentioned at the beginning, there are multiple things that point to the involvement of Syrian businessmen affiliated with the Syrian regime and Hezbollah in the procurement of the ship and the ammonium and the ownership of the ship and the ammonium nitrates. Whether those happen to all be coincidences or not, we don't know. But we were, for example, able to show that the person who owned the Rosas when it came to Lebanon owed $1 million to a bank in Cyprus that had been sanctioned for dealing with Hezbollah. An investigator, Firas Hatoum, was able to show that the Savaro, the company that owned the ammonium nitrate, was a shell company with links to two Syrian businessmen, one of whose brother was sanctioned by the US for procuring ammonium nitrate for the Syrian regime. So, there are indications that one theory is more credible than or viable than the other, but again, we weren't able to conclusively prove either. However, after the publication of our report last August, we did get a call from Hezbollah's international office asking us to come over for a cup of coffee, where during the meeting they told us that many people are blaming Hezbollah for the August 4 blast, and they hoped that we wouldn't be one of those organizations. You can make of that what you will. And they kept repeating to us, and their theory is that the material was being used by the Syrian opposition rather than the Syrian regime, and that the Syrian regime had other ways of procuring ammonium nitrate. But they weren't able, we pressed them for any evidence that would support their theory, and they weren't able to produce any evidence.
Thank you very much. Speaking, you mentioned Savaro, a few minutes ago. The question is, did you get any reaction from Savaro after the publication of the report? Because I guess in the report you mentioned that Savaro did not respond to your request. Did you get anything after the publication of the report?
No, they never responded to our request for information.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'll move on to more technical questions on the advocacy that TLDN can contribute to, so that we make this session a little bit action-oriented. So from your own perspective, are there any specific avenues or countries or capital cities where you see more potential for success or impact, and where you recommend that TLDN should be focusing on in their advocacy efforts?
So I think, fortunately or unfortunately, a lot of decisions that the international community makes on Lebanon are driven by France. So of course, France is a natural first place to do advocacy, both on the international investigation route and on the sanctions route. But we have also been pushing other countries, particularly countries who lost nationals in the blast, like Canada, the US, Australia, and Netherlands, to also not wait for France's green light, as they like to call it, and to move ahead with the international investigation, for example, regardless of what France's position is. So I think, within France, what I think is super important is to try to, the Lebanese diaspora in France, particularly the, diaspora who went to France in the 70s and 80s, are influential group of individuals, and they are supporters of Macron. And so their opinion and their advocacy does matter for Macron related to Lebanon. And so if Macron starts to feel like he's losing support because of his Lebanon policy from these key constituencies of Lebanese donors that he has to his campaign, but also the Francophone middle class in Lebanon, I think that might spur some action on their behalf. And we are already seeing some softening language around an international investigation. So I think some of the pressure is working. But again, the onus should not just be on France, and we are also doing advocacy in the US, Canada, Australia, and and the EU on both an international investigations and on sanctions.
Eli, can I add something?
Sure, please go ahead.
I mean, I appreciate the fact that France, has its own decision-making on this, but I don't think France is immune to pressure from countries such as the US. And I see in the chat a note from Faris Wehbi, where he says that as ONL, they're ready to do some advocacy on Washington, actually. And I mean, I would say it on behalf of Faris, between ONL and LAC, to which ONL belongs as well, they have a lot of say in what happens in Washington, and they can be used. And thank you, Faris, for making that offer, chat.
No, absolutely. I mean, we have tried to engage the State Department and other decision makers in DC on this issue, but for the US, their priorities are more Hezbollah related, and we didn't feel that there was enough engagement or interest from US decision makers to push this issue. And we also were a bit, I guess, hesitant to really try to ask the US to take this leadership role, given how it can be interpreted and politicized in Lebanon. But
you have to work silently in Washington, I think.
Yeah, but having said that, I think, we have renewed some of our engagement with the State Department and with some Congress people who are interested in Lebanon on this. So for sure, if, I'd love to chat later. And I think you mentioned the LIC, is that Joseph Speyli, right?
LACC, which includes 6 advocacy organizations, including LIC.
Okay. So I had a very brief chat with LIC last week about that we should connect and discuss US advocacy more. So it'd be great to have a larger discussion between all of these groups on a strategy for advocacy in the US moving forward.
Faris, if I may ask you, can you organize a session whereby some of us may participate in the discussion with the LACC members?
Yes, and one of the guiding principles of LACC is to advocate for the port explosion. So it's not like it is one of the main issues. So yes, I will, maybe somebody gives me Aya's information, I'll set something up and we'll go.
Well, Faris, if I may, before I had not read that report that was done in 2021, but because of this call, I did read it. And the material that is in it is incredibly detailed, and there's a lot of it. All the stuff that we heard over the past 2 years is all documented in there. The documents are there in Arabic and translated in English. It's very impressive for this young woman sitting here with us, Aya, to have been one of the main authors of this research. Really. So maybe you can take a look at that report.
Of course.
Okay.
Great. Thank you. So any other question, any comment? Aya, would you like to take it? Yes. So
gonna give me Aya's information later on? Just send it to me.
Renee or Nancy, I guess.
Will do.
Yeah. So Aya, would you like to take a minute to provide any closing statement? Anything that you'd like to add or?
I mean, the one thing I'll say is, the last couple of years have been very frustrating domestically and internationally on the Beirut blast, but, justice takes time, accountability takes time. So, we're already seeing some people, even in Lebanon, start to lose interest in the issues relating to the Beirut blast. And this was shown in the relatively lower turnout on August 4 than we had last year, for example. And I would just urge everyone to keep this issue alive, to keep fighting for justice on this issue, realizing that it's frustrating, but that these things always take time. But really the Beirut blast was a perfect example of just how destructive and deadly corruption and incompetence can be. And it's, you know, just unacceptable to move past it without holding those responsible and accountable. And those same people are still in power, they're still in parliament, they're still heading security institutions. And so there's nothing preventing another August 4 from happening again. So I think it's our collective responsibility to not forget August 4 and to keep pushing in all of our avenues for justice and accountability.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Renee, Nancy, Rania,
Thank
and
you.
everyone from the
Thank you.
TLDN committee
Thanks,
for
everyone.
your
Most of all,
efforts
thank you,
making
Aya.
this possible. Thank you for the others who attended in a season of vacation and trips and etc. So wishing everyone the best, and until the next event, stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you, God
everyone.
bless.
Thank you, Aya.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Great meeting. Thank you, everyone.